The Horse in Motion by Eadweard Muybridge. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at one of the most remarkable images in the history of both art and science, the horse in motion, created by Eadweard Muybridge in 1878. This is not just a photograph, it is a revolution, frozen on paper. Who was Eadweard Muybridge? To understand why this image matters so much, we first need to know the man behind it. Eadweard Muybridge was born in 1830 in Kingston upon Thames, England. His birth name was Edward James Muggeridge, a rather ordinary name for a man who would turn out to be anything but ordinary. He emigrated to the United States as a young man and eventually settled in California, where he built a reputation as one of the most technically gifted photographers of his era. His life, however, was far from peaceful. In 1874, Muybridge shot and killed his wife's lover, a man named Harry Larkins. He stood trial for murder, but was acquitted by a jury who accepted his defense of justifiable homicide. The trial was a sensation, and then, almost immediately after, Muybridge simply went back to work. That singular focus, that obsessive return to the craft, tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He traveled extensively, photographing the landscapes of Alaska and Central America. His panoramic photographs of San Francisco are still considered masterpieces of 19th century photography. But it is his work in motion studies that secured his place in history forever. The question that started everything. Now, let's talk about this image specifically. In the 1870s, there was a famous and genuinely unresolved debate. When a horse gallops at full speed, are all four of its hooves ever simultaneously off the ground? It sounds like a trivial question, but for painters, sculptors, scientists, and horse breeders, it was a serious matter. Human eyes simply could not track the motion fast enough to answer it. Leland Stanford, the railroad magnate, governor of California, and founder of Stanford University, was convinced the answer was yes. He hired Muybridge to prove it. The challenge was immense. Photography in the 1870s required long exposure times. Capturing a galloping horse without blur seemed nearly impossible. But Muybridge was relentless. He experimented for years, and in June of 1878 at Stanford's Palo Alto racetrack, he achieved what many thought could not be done. The photograph itself. What you are looking at is a composite print, 12 sequential frames arranged in a 3x4 grid, each numbered. The subject is a mare named Sally Gardner, owned by Leland Stanford, photographed running at a 1.40 gait. That is 1 mile in 1 minute and 40 seconds. A serious racing pace. To capture these images, Muybridge set up a series of cameras alongside the track, 12 in total, each triggered by a fine thread stretched across the path. As Sally Gardner galloped past, she snapped each thread in sequence, triggering the shutters one after another in rapid succession. The exposure time of each negative was less than 1/2000th of a second. That was an astonishing technical achievement for 1878. Look at the images carefully. In frame number 3, you can clearly see it. All four hooves are airborne. Stanford's wager was vindicated. The horse does, in fact, become fully airborne during the gallop. For centuries, painters had depicted horses mid-stride with at least one hoof always touching the ground. Overnight, Muybridge revealed that they had all been wrong. The text beneath the images notes that negatives were taken at intervals of 27 inches of distance and roughly 1/25th of a second of time. The grid lines visible in each frame were part of the measurement system Muybridge used to track exact position and progress across the track. Why this image changed everything. The impact of this work is difficult to overstate. First, it changed art. Painters and sculptors immediately began correcting the way horses in motion were depicted. Edgar Degas, one of the greatest artists of the 19th century, studied Muybridge's motion studies carefully. You can see the influence in how Degas repositioned the legs of his racing horses after 1878. Second, it changed science. Muybridge's technique became the foundation for biomechanics, the scientific study of how living bodies move. Doctors, physiologists, and athletes would go on to use sequential photography to analyze everything from human walking patterns to the biomechanics of sports injuries. Third, and perhaps most profoundly, it gave birth to cinema. Muybridge went further than still photography. He invented a device he called the zoopraxiscope, which projected his sequential images in rapid succession, creating the illusion of movement. He was projecting moving images onto a screen more than 15 years before the Lumiere brothers famously presented their cinematograph in Paris in 1895. Muybridge is, by any reasonable definition, one of the fathers of film. The aesthetic dimension. But let's not forget the purely visual power of this image. There is something deeply beautiful about the horse in motion that goes beyond its scientific significance. The silhouettes of horse and rider, rendered in deep black against the pale grid, have an almost graphic, modern quality. They look like they could hang in a contemporary gallery today without any adjustment whatsoever. The repetition of the form across the 12 frames creates a rhythm, almost like a musical score, each frame a note in a visual melody of movement. You follow the horse's body as it rises, extends, contracts, and pushes forward. It is simultaneously a document and a dance. There is also something quietly poetic about the context. A man named Muybridge, who had survived murder charges and personal tragedy, standing at the edge of a racetrack in California with his cameras and his threads and his relentless curiosity, capturing something no human eye had ever truly seen before. Time, sliced thin as paper. Legacy. Muybridge went on to produce thousands of motion studies, humans walking, jumping, climbing stairs, and animals of every kind. His monumental work, Animal Locomotion, published in 1887, contained over 100,000 images across 781 plates. It remains one of the most extraordinary photographic projects ever undertaken. He died in 1904, back in England, in the town where he was born. He spent his final years tending a scale model of the Great Lakes in his garden, a fittingly eccentric end for a man who spent his life measuring the world in fractions of a second. The horse in motion is not just a photograph. It is the moment when human beings first truly saw motion, not felt it, not guessed at it, but saw it, objectively, scientifically, and beautifully. It is the image where art and science shook hands, and neither was ever quite the same again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, please subscribe and leave a comment below. What other works would you like to explore? See you next time.